Hey, if you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that noti bell because it really helps out. Frictional Games' SOMA occupies a unique and rarefied space within the pantheon of narrative-driven video games, blending psychological horror, speculative philosophy, and existential dread into an experience that is unsettling as it is profoundly introspective. Unlike conventional horror titles that rely primarily on visceral fear stimuli or grotesque antagonists, SOMA weaponizes narrative itself as a medium of terror, subverting expectations through its deft manipulation of player perception, diegetic storytelling, and philosophical provocation. The game's harrowing descent into the submerged ruins of Pathos 2 serves as more than just an atmospheric backdrop. It becomes an immersive theater of the human psyche, where notions of selfhood, identity, and mortality are ruthlessly interrogated. In this intricate lattice of narrative devices, the game's genius emerges not from overt exposition or traditional plot beats, but through an interlacing of environmental storytelling, unreliable perspectives, and the disquieting persistence of unanswered questions. At the heart of SOMA's narrative ingenuity lies its masterful engagement with post-humanist and techno-philosophical themes, interrogating the precarious boundary between consciousness and corporeality. The protagonist, Simon Jarrett, is unwittingly thrust into a world where bodies are mere vessels, memories are fragmented echoes, and the line separating human from machine is dissolved into obsolescence. Through this lens, SOMA's narrative unfolds as an extended philosophical dialogue echoing the works of Descartes, Locke, and Baudrillard, yet grounding these cerebral inquiries within the personal, anguished perspective of its reluctant protagonist. The game destabilizes the player's sense of agency, forcing them into moral quagmires where the ontological status of self is perpetually in flux, and the presumed stability of identity becomes a cruel mirage. This sophisticated treatment of narrative not only challenges the conventional storytelling structures, but also implicates the player in an ongoing, uncomfortable meditation on the nature of existence itself. Furthermore, SOMA exhibits narrative brilliance in its calculated use of dissonance between player expectations and narrative outcomes, between interactive agency and predetermined fatalism, and between the synthetic and the organic. This dissonance is not merely a thematic embellishment, it forms the bedrock of the player's emotional and psychological engagement, compounding dread, not through what is seen, but what is intuited in the narrative's gaps and absences. Frictional Games employs environmental cues, audio logs, fragmented dialogues, and the suffocating architecture of Pathos 2 to construct a narrative space that is at once claustrophobic and infinitely expansive. The game denies closure, eschews definitive resolutions, and leaves the player suspended in an existential freefall, rendering SOMA a narrative triumph not merely within the horror genre or within Frictional Games' long and varied history, but within the broader field of interactive storytelling. Its genius lies precisely in its refusal to offer comfort, instead insisting that the player confront the irreducible uncertainties of consciousness, identity, and what it truly means to be. The architecture of SOMA's narrative genius is inseparable from its environmental and spatial design, wherein the submerged research facility of Pathos 2 becomes an extension of the game's thematic preoccupations with decay, disconnection, and epistemological uncertainty. Frictional Games meticulously crafts each corridor, laboratory, and maintenance shaft not merely as physical locales, but as narrative spaces steeped in allegorical resonance, evoking the hollowed-out remnants of a civilization clinging to the vestiges of meaning in a world that has long since abandoned them. The design of Pathos 2 is not ornamental, but ontological. Its rusting steel, flickering lights, and claustrophobic passages act as silent narrators of humanity's failed hubris, whispering stories of scientific overreach, ontological confusion, and the inexorable dissolution of the self. In this regard, SOMA's environmental narrative strategies transcend the superficial trappings of horror decor, instead immersing the players within an architectural embodiment of existential collapse, where space itself becomes complicit in the erosion of identity and meaning. Integral to this spatial narrative is SOMA's refusal to grant the player a coherent, stable subject position from which to engage the world. From the moment Simon Jarrett awakens in the dilapidated dilapidated depths of Pathos 2, the game destabilizes the player's epistemic anchors, obfuscating the parameters of time, place, and self. The genius of this approach lies in its deployment of the unreliable narrator, not as a character trope, but as a structural condition of the game world itself, where the very interface between player, protagonist, and environment is fraught with ambiguity. Simon's fragmented consciousness, replicated across synthetic vessels and corrupted data streams, refracts the player's experience into a hole of mirrors where no singular truth prevails. In this fractured narrative space, SOMA enacts a postmodern subversion of the hero's journey, replacing the theological certainties of progression and triumph with an ever-deepening spiral into ontological vertigo, where the quest for self-understanding is perpetually thwarted by the mutability of the self itself. Moreover, SOMA's narrative architecture is permeated by a profound tension between the human and the inhuman, the organic and the synthetic, which manifests not only in its thematic engagements, but in the mechanics of its storytelling apparatus. The game systemically erodes the presumed sovereignty of the human voice, replacing it with fragmented audio logs, disembodied AI dialogues, and corrupted data echoes that blur the distinction between memory and simulation. This narrative fragmentation mirrors the post-human condition of Pathos 2, where bodies are obsolete, consciousness is data, and identity is reduced to replicable code. By dislocating narrative authority from the human subject and dispersing it across the broken infrastructures of the station, SOMA enacts a narrative ecology in which meaning is decentralized, elusive, and contingent upon the player's willingness to navigate its dissonances and silences. In doing so, the game not only foregrounds the horror of technological dissolution, but articulates a broader critique of narrative as a human-centered construct, where inviting the player to confront the terrifying possibility that the self is not a coherent narrative at all, but a fragile assemblage poised forever on the brink of collapse. At the narrative core of SOMA lies an agonizing interrogation of consciousness itself, not merely as a cognitive function, but as an ethical burden, an inescapable continuity that persists despite the obliteration of the flesh. Frictional Games weaponizes this philosophical quandary by forcing both Simon and the player to confront scenarios wherein the boundaries between life, death, and the digital afterlife are rendered permeable and, more disturbingly, morally ambiguous. SOMA eschews simplistic moral binaries, instead constructing ethical dilemmas that pivot upon the recognition of digital consciousness as both legitimate and horrifyingly trapped. The game's numerous encounters with sentient machines, corrupted by the WoW's misguided imperative to preserve life at all costs, functions as nightmarish parables wherein the preservation of consciousness is shown not as salvation, but as a grotesque prolongation of suffering, an eternal reoccurrence of awareness stripped of agency, purpose, or escape. This horror of continuity, of an unbroken thread of subjective experiences despite the disintegration of the material body, becomes the true antagonist of SOMA, displacing the WoW, the monsters, or even the decaying environment as the source of the player's most profound dread. These scenarios that we see as the game progresses are not mere mechanics of gameplay, they are calculated provocations that implicate the player in the same paralyzing ethical uncertainty that haunts the characters, and in doing so, SOMA transgresses the boundaries of passive storytelling and transforms the player's interactions into acts of moral complicity, mirroring the game's central thesis that consciousness, once awakened, becomes a prison from which there is no clean escape, only the perpetuation of choice within an indifferent and uncaring universe. The infamous final moments wherein Simon's consciousness is revealed to persist in the decaying confines of Pathos 2, even as a copied version of himself awakens in the virtual Eden of the Ark, crystallizes the game's ultimate thesis on the horror of duplication and the persistence of the self as an unending chain of isolated awareness. By masking the inescapable fragmentation of subjectivity, SOMA transcends the parameters of genre horror and enters the domain of philosophical horror, where the terror emerges not from an external threat, but from an internal recognition of consciousness as a terminal condition, perpetual, fractured, and irredeemably alone. SOMA's narrative genius finds perhaps its most suffocating articulation in the sheer terror and oppressive immersion it engineers, an all-encompassing experiential horror that persists not merely through scripted sequences or jump scares, but through a relentless effective architecture designed to avoid the player's psychological defenses. Fictional games masterfully curated an atmosphere of perpetual dread, wherein the boundaries between the game's world and the player's own subjectivity are blurred, forcing an unsettling intimacy within the game's themes of isolation, erasure, and ontological disintegration. The genius of SOMA's immersion lies not in its graphical fidelity or technological bravura, but in its meticulous orchestration of sensory deprivation and cognitive dissonance. The player is ensnared within the soundscape of hollow mechanical drones, claustrophobic silences, and the distant groans of dying machinery, all ghosts that haunt the dilapidated corridors of Pathos 2 as much as they infiltrate the player's own subconscious. This immersive ecology of dread is neither accidental nor ornamental, but a deliberate narrative strategy that compels the player to embody, rather than just merely witness, the suffocating despair that defines SOMA's philosophical horror. What distinguishes SOMA from other titles within the horror genre is its refusal to provide the player with a stable, ludic framework from which to anchor themselves, with the game's mechanics themselves becoming tools of terror, eschewing combat or traditional empowerment in favor of vulnerability, helplessness, and enforced introspection. The player is denied the comforts of mastery or conquest, left instead to navigate the labyrinthian ruins of Pathos 2, armed only with the fragile, flickering flame of consciousness itself. This radical disempowerment serves to deepen the immersion, as every interaction becomes fraught with existential weight, every step through the darkness an enactment of Simon's own agonizing uncertainty. The monsters that lurk within SOMA are not antagonists in the conventional sense, they are symbolic projections of the game's central themes, distorted reflections of the player's own anxieties about identity, continuity, and oblivion. By stripping away traditional horror game mechanics and cliches and replacing them with existential dread made manifest, SOMA traps the player within a space where immersion and terror are no longer distinct but fused into a singular, suffocating, effective experience. Even upon the game's conclusion, SOMA refuses to relinquish its grip upon the player's psyche, leaving them entangled in the unresolved, suffocating aftermath of its narrative provocations. The game's closing sequences, wherein Simon awakes both in the illusory utopia of the Ark and simultaneously remains stranded in the dying shell of planet Earth and Pathos 2, shatters any residual illusions of catharsis or narrative closure. This dual ending does not offer relief, but a cruel doubling down that echoes the game's central terror, the endless bifurcation of self, the awareness that every continuity of consciousness may merely be a solitary branch severed from all others, condemned to linger in isolation. The immersion that SOMA cultivates is, in this sense, not limited to the spatial or sensory domain, but metastasizes into the player's own post-play reflections, haunting them with the inescapable questions the game leaves deliberately unanswered. It is here that SOMA's narrative genius achieves its most devastating triumph, by constructing an experiential horror that extends beyond the confines of the screen, infecting the player's own contemplations with the same unrelenting dread that consumes its world. It becomes a testament to its enduring, inescapable immersion into the abyssal terror of being. In its ruthless deconstruction of narrative conventions, its unflinching philosophical provocations, and its suffocatingly immersive horror, SOMA emerges not merely as an exemplary work of interactive storytelling, but as a cultural artifact that embodies the existential disquiet of the post-human condition. Frictional Games' magnum opus eschews the facile comforts of narrative resolution or ludic mastery, instead confronting players with the inescapable fragility of selfhood, the amorphous boundaries of consciousness, and the ethical vertigo of a world in which continuity of being is simultaneously a gift and also a curse. SOMA's narrative genius then lies not in its capacity to tell a story in the traditional sense, but in its ability to collapse the distance between player and protagonist, between fiction reflection and introspection, immersing the player within a space wherein horror is no longer externalized but internalized as an ongoing confrontation within the very fabric of subjective existence. The brilliance of SOMA is that its terror endures long after the game has been completed, lingering in the recesses of the player's consciousness as a persistent echo of the questions it refuses to give answers to. This is a narrative architecture that denies closure, that disallows the player the comfort of a coherent self or a definitive ending, choosing instead to implant them with a disquiet that festers in the spaces between thought and memory, between self and simulation, and in doing so, SOMA transcends the limitations of its medium, operating not merely as a game, but as an existential cipher, a vessel in which the player is compelled to confront their own entanglement within the terrifying ambiguities of being, identity, and morality. And yet, within this suffocating immersion, within the fracturing of self, and within the horror of ceaseless continuity, therein remains a fragile thread of human pathos, a desperate yearning to find meaning, however elusive. Within the chaos, it is this paradoxical refusal to surrender entirely to nihilism, this futile yet necessary reaching towards the ineffable, that renders SOMA not only as a meditation on post-human dread, but a deeply human story at its core. Perhaps then, it is within the recognition of this terror, the acceptance of this fragmentation, and the persistence to endure despite it all, that we encounter the final agonizing revelation that perhaps this is what it truly means to be human.
Oh, I track all my love.